Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's presentation brought to you by the Sudden Arrhythmic Death Syndromes Foundation with support from Invitae, titled State of the Molecular Autopsy. Today's presenter is Dr. Michael Ackerman, who is the Windland Smith-Rice Cardiovascular Genomics Research Professor and Professor of Medicine, Pediatrics, and Pharmacology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He is a consultant in cardiovascular diseases and pediatric cardiology and is the director of Mayo Clinic's LQTS Syndrome Genetic Heart Rhythm Clinic. Among many awards and recognitions, Dr. Ackerman was awarded the Heart Rhythm Society Distinguished Scientist Award in 2018, recognizing his outstanding contributions to the field and to the society. Before Dr. Ackerman begins today, I would like to briefly mention that you can submit questions for Dr. Ackerman anytime during the presentation by using the questions pane of your webinar control panel. Dr. Ackerman will address these during today's Q&A session. Also, today's webinar will be recorded and available for later viewing, both on the SADS Foundation website and on the Invitae website. Dr. Ackerman, we thank you for your participation and have been looking forward to it.
Great, thanks, Dr. Callis, and good afternoon, everybody out there in webinar land. I'm delighted to get to be with you. I'm going to figure out how to hide a control panel here for the 63 attendees, which will grow, and let's get started. I love this topic. I hope you do as well, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and the conversation that we can at least have through the webinar space about this topic of the molecular autopsy for the investigation of the tragedy of sudden death. So let's jump in and get going. I'm conflicted. These are my conflicts of interest to disclose. In particular, I do have a consulting relationship with Invitae. More important to disclose is my relationship with the SADS Foundation. I've had the privilege of serving as the president of the board since 2006 in partnership with Alice Laura, who is our CEO, and we're delighted from the SADS Foundation that you have chosen to join us for this webinar, and we encourage you to partner with us at the SADS Foundation, and we just want to acknowledge and thank Invitae's sponsorship of the webinar series, which this is the kickoff one, and we'll have a series of 3 of them, and then hopefully we'll be doing more together and creating the topics that address your needs. For now, over the next 40 minutes, what I'm hoping that I can detail together for us is the state of the molecular autopsy or postmortem genetic testing, however you like to think about it, and then we will examine what are the threats to the molecular autopsy that can potentially derail it even before it gets fully incorporated into the standard care of practice when there's been somebody who has sudden death, either explained from an autopsy or unexplained after the autopsy. And so when we think about sudden cardiac death in the young, for the past 2 decades now, we've had postmortem genetic testing, or what we called 20 years ago, the molecular autopsy, where we would search for a monogenetic basis of X that marks the spot, or in this case, the circle that marks the spot for the root cause. And when we think about the role of the molecular autopsy, I think it's important to understand the epidemiology of sudden death of a young person. And for our discussion, we're going to define SCDY, or sudden cardiac death in the young, as anybody my age, or for all of us out there in the webinar, our age or younger. So youthful sudden death. And you'll hear things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the most common cause of sudden cardiac death in the young. Not true. You'll hear things like most of sudden death in the young has a positive autopsy. Not true. And so I think the best way of understanding the epidemiology of sudden death is the half and halves. Halves show it and half don't show it. In other words, half of sudden cardiac death in the young is autopsy positive, where the medical examiner, forensic pathologist, coroner, by eye or by microscope, they can tell us the reason. The other half, and fully half, are autopsy negative. And when we think of the molecular autopsy, we generally think of it for autopsy negative sudden death because there's no explanation. Let's find or search the genetic code for one. But I would make the case that where the molecular autopsy in 2019 works the best, with the best signal to noise performance characteristics, is in fact when the autopsy is positive. And the medical examiner tells us that the reason for the sudden death is the disease called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, seen at gross or microscopically and so forth. Because it's in this setting where the connection or the concordance with the genetic test results in that sudden death victim will perform the best. In other words, if the medical examiner told it was a young person who died from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and if you and I understand what the performance characteristics would have been of the genetic test if that person would have been alive and diagnosed and had a certain profile of clinical endophenotype for his or her HCM, we would have known that the yield of the genetic test would have been, in that situation, 80%. If we understand the noise in the HCM genetic test at around 5%, we would then have a pre-test signal to noise ratio of 16-to-1 odds without even reading the genetic test report. So now we have the sudden death victim who is 20 years old, who has HCM by the medical examiner, and we do the molecular autopsy, postmortem genetic testing, and the company, whatever genetic test company we're talking about, gives us a report back saying it found a variant of uncertain significance of VUS, and we'll talk about those VUSs and the VUS crisis, in this case in the gene MYH7. Well, I would submit that they, the genetic test company, might have had to call it ambiguously as a VUS in that gene MYH7 that encodes that protein beta-myosin heavy chain. But you and I don't have to, because we are the phenotypers. And in that setting, that result would not be ambiguous. That would be, in fact, genotype positive, autopsy positive, and genotype positive, where the verdict would then be sudden cardiac death secondary to MYH7 mediated hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And how certain would I be in this example? I would have 40-to-1 odds of being right, or a residual chance of a 2.5% likelihood of being wrong. In other words, I would already be at a threshold that the American College of Medical Genetics needs for that variant to be called definitely pathogenic. And that definite conclusion would be independent of all of the in silico tools that a company uses, all of the genetic findings, functional data, that's without the tools. Now you add onto the report that the company tells you that that variant has not been seen in the public databases, that that variant in silico is predicted to be benign. We are so far past a VUS, we are promoted well out of genetic purgatory into a clinically actionable cause of death that we can then use for cascade testing of the surviving family members. It performs the best, it being the molecular autopsy, when the autopsy is positive. But we often rely on it only when the autopsy is negative, and that's wrong. We should be doing postmortem genetic testing in both scenarios when we suspect that the young person died a sudden cardiac death, autopsy positive or autopsy negative. But it is autopsy negative sudden death where the molecular autopsy was first invented, if you will. And that really came out of questions like these that were posed to us in the last millennium, as why did my 17-year-old son die? This was the mother's question posed to me some 20 years ago. And fathers, we ask the question as well when tragedy like this strikes. 20 years ago, this decedent was previously healthy as a teenager until he was suddenly dead in bed at the age of 17. The autopsy, stone cold normal, by eye, by microscope, with the eyes who are looking at the autopsy being good eyes, meaning a medical examiner who knows what he is looking at and looking for. Now, what often happens, as many of you will attest to, is when the autopsy is negative in a small community, the local newspaper goes crazy, and it did for this family, where they wrote a half-page editorial called "Parents, Talk to Your Kids." They were sure cause and manner of death was bad adolescent behavior, and this mother was not satisfied with that expert opinion, and ultimately we were institution number 5. And this is one of the points where phenotyping doesn't stop at sudden death. In fact, phenotyping really begins because we need to understand the nature of the death and the nature of the story in the living. And we elicited a clue in the family history of the mother who some 30 years prior had fallen from a 3-meter diving board. We said, you're not clumsy at age 9 and do that, and then years later your son doesn't die in bed suddenly and unexpectedly. Let's do testing. So we do testing of the living, the mother. All testing's negative. We do testing of the dead, the deceased, and here was the first time that we reported the molecular autopsy in a title in a paper where, in this case, for this decedent, we would fail to find 5 very important nucleotides in the KCNQ1 encoded Kv7.1 potassium channel. In other words, classic LQT1 causative variant being identified. Now, of course, dead in bed. Sometimes the phenotype, the setting, doesn't match the genotype. And as we shared, and as this mother shared, without the molecular autopsy, our family would have had to live with false rumors. When the molecular autopsy is positive, and crisply, definitively positive, the power of the molecular autopsy is incredible. Closure and clarity. Closure for the families to give them the answer that they've longed for. Why did my loved one die? Clarity as to what does this mean for the rest of the family. And for this, years afterwards, we would have the guidelines tell us what we had already done years prior. That is, answer the mother's question. Does my 13-year-old living have what killed my 17-year-old? In other words, we would do cascade variant specific genetic testing as we advised in 2011 and find the answer. In this case, the answer is yes. And not surprising to those of us in the long QT world, this child who is mutation positive is alive and well, because when we discover the mutation before death, death virtually never happens. And so we could provide the closure and the clarity, and that's what the molecular autopsy can do. Now, when we do the molecular autopsy in the setting of an unexplained sudden death that remains autopsy negative, we need to be sure we're calibrated. And here, I've seen calibrations all over the map where there are medical examiners' offices that are doing the molecular autopsy and claiming that they get answers 80–90% of the time, claiming that they have a positive molecular autopsy even in 40% of infant deaths. When you hear those claims, be very skeptical. They might be coming from states that are actively inhaling, if you know what I mean, because they are wrong. We better be calibrated right. In other words, if you have a person who you're working with that family and that decedent because of autopsy negative SUD, how often are you expecting the autopsy to be positive? The molecular autopsy. Number one, do you not know what the molecular autopsy is yet? I hope you do. If not, we'll make sure we do. 5 to 10%, 15 to 20, 25 to 30, greater than 50. The correct answer, with some caveats, is if you had to bet, without knowing about the death circumstances, about the phenotype of sudden death, you would say we have about a 25 to 30% likelihood that that genetic test, that postmortem genetic test, will come back positive. We owe that answer and credit to that answer to my lead scientist, Dave Tester, who he and I have published over 18 papers on the molecular autopsy since our first one now 20 years ago. And this number, 25 to 30%, has now been validated really across the globe. Australia, New Zealand, Europe, you name it, we're kind of centering in on that number. Now, I want you to remember 25 to 30% overall, but then I want you to quickly forget it and say, wait a second, tell me some circumstances about the sudden death, and then I'm going to refine my pre-test estimate that the molecular autopsy will be positive. So here's where it starts from, is these cases of sudden unexplained death. We've now done over 300 molecular autopsies after the first birthday and over 600 before the first birthday. You can see here the average age at sudden death was 18 years. 40% we elicited a family history or a personal prior history that wasn't acted upon. That's a little high, and that's why the 25 to 30% overall might be slightly inflated. But it's in that context where we nailed down that point estimate of 25 to 30%. We'll come back with an actionable variant, not a VUS, an actionable variant. Now we refine that by knowing a few things about the sudden death victim. Are we talking about a female or a male? We've seen a difference, and others have as well. The a priori likelihood of being genetically mediated is higher when it's a young woman who dies suddenly and unexpectedly than when it's a young man. And then there's an age dependency where you see our highest yield is in the adolescent female, where we hit almost 50% coming back mutation positive for a cardiac channelopathy. And again, here that makes sense if you understand when unrecognized, untreated long QT syndrome and CPVT rear their head that can cause a sudden death where the autopsy is completely normal. These numbers start to make sense. That is not 80%, and that's an interesting observation, is if most of autopsy negative sudden unexplained death is also genetic negative, then what's killing these young people? We'll come back to that perhaps in our conversation. And so don't believe anybody who says 80%. When it comes to infant death, don't believe anybody who says a third of infant deaths or SIDS are channelopathic. Wrong. We've been working for a long time, and we cannot get the monogenetic basis of SIDS to be higher than 10%. That's the ceiling, and I don't think it's going to budge higher than that. If anything, it's drifting down to the 5 to 10% range. But it's kind of interesting. Not all SIDS is the same. If that infant dies suddenly and unexpectedly before 2 months of age or after 4 months of age, then the yield is actually around 25%. But if it's in that age window of epidemiologic SIDS, where most infants die 2 to 4 months of age, then the molecular autopsy is positive less than 5% of the time. So that's just a little bit of frame of reference for infant death. Now, what have the guidelines done? 8 years ago, we said in the first guidelines that the molecular autopsy may be considered. We didn't give it stronger language of a mandate. That stronger argument as standard of care has been happening. And what I want you to notice is we said you could do a comprehensive genetic analysis, or if the autopsy is negative, you could just do 4 genes, RYR2 for CPVT, and the 3 canonical long QT syndrome causative genes. Now that seems so small and puny, just 4 genes now, but you're going to see shortly why it actually might make sense that that still is the best molecular autopsy when the conventional autopsy is negative. It certainly is the most interpretable molecular autopsy, but we'll come back to that. Now, 4 genes is so yesterday, because after all, why not look at all of the genes, the 20 to 25,000 genes, or at least their exomes? So we pronounced the first updated molecular autopsy as the WEMA molecular autopsy 5 years ago in 2015 as the whole exome molecular autopsy. And I do think this is the way to go about it in terms of acquiring the data, but we often will do a gene-specific targeted analysis. So yes, we can do more genes, and when we do, what kind of yield do you think we get? We showed this. Look at these sudden death victims. Their age, 27 years, that's interesting, white and black, and from Cook County, Illinois, where the medical examiners are really good at identifying cause and manner of death. In other words, if they tell you there's no gunshot wounds or knives, there's not. And if they tell you it's autopsy negative, it is. But in this setting, what would you guess the yield is? 25 to 30%? 50%? No, not even close. Under 20%. But what if we change the setting of the sudden death and the circumstances and the phenotype of the sudden death victims to this cohort analysis? What if they're now younger, 11 years on average at the time of death? And what if not only the autopsy is negative, but the death occurred during documented exertion? Now, that same WEMA, whole exome molecular autopsy, is giving us an answer in 44% of them. In other words, phenotyping must continue in the post-sudden death investigation. Well, that's the performance. What are the issues that are the impediments or the frustrations or the things that are derailing the molecular autopsy that we better get our arms around? And we'll spend a little bit of time to set up your conversation subsequently. The first has been, and I think it is past tense, the cost. Certainly in private pay systems in North America, the insurance companies do not like to pay for things when you've died. And so until recently, until the price point of genetic testing was onerous, above $5,000, think of it. Genetic testing for cardiac diseases just a few years ago was over $5,000 out of pocket. And then insurance companies, if they covered it, they only covered it until your date of death. And now we've seen that being disrupted because now we can secure genetic testing for all known cardiac channelopathy genes, all known cardiomyopathy genes in a territory of under $500, sometimes for the medical examiners, under $300. So the cost issue is being neutralized by the transformative pricing of genetic testing that we've seen over the past 15 years since genetic testing for genetic heart rhythm diseases first came out clinically in 2004. So I don't think we have to do too much more on the cost issue. And second have been the medical examiner's SOP, their standard operating procedures, that we still have a lot of work to do because they are not securing tissue that is DNA friendly to think about what would be the next tier of investigation should the autopsy be negative. And in fact, as I mentioned, they should be thinking about this when the autopsy is positive. And then last, I think we are fumbling the ball terribly when it comes to interpreting the molecular autopsy. We are over-interpreting and we're making colossal mistakes, which I'll illustrate, by prematurely assuming or promoting a VUS as actionable when it really should be staying in purgatory. In other words, X does not always mark the spot. Well, we've done the cost one. Like I said, I think that's been neutralized. We all need to work with our local medical examiners, coroners' offices to get this. 8 years ago, we've been saying it's a class 1 recommendation to get tissue that would lend itself for a subsequent postmortem genetic test. Not necessarily do it, but at least get it. And now 8 years after that class 1 recommendation, the number of times when we do not have DNA-friendly tissue is still frustrating. Now, we are making success with being able to extract high enough quality DNA out of paraffin-embedded formalin-fixed tissue, from formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissue, and do the molecular autopsy from that source. But don't tell them that, them being the medical examiners. I don't want them to know that yet, because I want them to think DNA friendly where tissue is the issue, and this is still not ideal tissue. We need blood spot cards, blood and EDTA at the time of the evaluation, frozen tissue that would allow us to extract DNA. So we all need to work on that. So I would love it. I would love it when I do a sudden death evaluation and we're not told, sorry, no tissue retained, or sorry, all we have is wax. But when they say, here I'm coming for my survivor evaluation, the loved one who died, here is the blood spot card in hand, ready to analyze. That will be a significant advance for our families and for the evaluation of sudden death. The rest of our time is going to be spent on the most important item that is certainly derailing the molecular autopsy, and where I think as a community of sudden death evaluators and those securing the molecular test and communicating the results to the families, I think I would give the grade, our grade collectively in the United States, a C- D+, and that might be generous. In other words, when we get a report back that tells us that something has been found and it's pathogenic, likely pathogenic, or a variant of uncertain significance, how sure are we that that represents that decedent's disease-causative mutation? We better be right. If we're going to be using the genetic test for closure and clarity, we better be right. And here's where the signal to noise characteristics when you're dead becomes way more important than when you're alive, with Exhibit A as the cardiac test findings. And that's again why the postmortem genetic test works better when the conventional autopsy in fact tells us what the name of the genetic heart rhythm or genetic heart muscle disease is. And I want to just make sure you understand the performance characteristics and how it breaks down. When you're alive and you and I tell that patient, you definitely have long QT syndrome because your short score is 5 and so forth, that variant that comes back, that's rare, regardless of what the company says it is, has a 15-to-1 odds of being likely pathogenic. On CPVT, probably our best pound-for-pound genetic test when you're alive, has a 20-to-1 signal-to-noise ratio. And that's when we say, you, living patient, you are CPVT. But then what if that phenotype isn't so clear? The signal-to-noise starts to collapse. And out in the real world, the yield of the CPVT genetic test among patients submitted for CPVT genetic testing is not 60 to 65%, which is what it would be if every case submitted was a great CPVT case. Instead, the overall yield from one of the genetic test companies was only 15%. And that's a live person where a clinician has said, you have CPVT. So you can imagine what kind of weak cases are being submitted under the name of CPVT. And when that case is weak, look what happens. The noise doesn't change. Now we're going to be wrong 20% of the time. I don't like being wrong that often. And what if you're dead, suddenly dead, autopsy's negative, and you have a rare RYR2 variant? Don't assume that you have all of a sudden converted autopsy negative sudden death to type 1 CPVT as the explanation. If you always make that assumption in that context, we are going to be wrong a third of the time. So we'll provide closure incorrectly 33% of the time. We'll do cascade testing chasing the wrong thing 33% of the time. And so though in that context, that RYR2 VUS is way deeper in purgatory than if the company told us it was a VUS, but the person who they told it was a VUS was somebody who's alive, who fainted 90 meters into the 100-meter dash, who on evaluation had a stress test was classic for CPVT. That's not a VUS. And certainly that's not the same VUS as the person who's suddenly dead at sleep with an autopsy negative who comes back with a rare thing in RYR2. Signal to noise is critical. And so when the autopsy is positive, the signal to noise is better. When the autopsy is negative, we've got to be way more careful. This is not a good phenotype in terms of being that predictive and informative. Because remember what the yield is of channelopathies in autopsy negative sudden death? It's 25 to 30%. If all of these cases where the autopsy was negative were channelopathies, our yield should be north of 75 to 80%, but it's not. And so that's why we have to deal with this pendulum that's swung, where now you and I are seeing medical examiners' reports where when the autopsy is negative, the report is getting signed out as cause of death, long QT syndrome, as if the absence of any evidence by gross or microscopy now equals the diagnosis of long QT syndrome. And then that gets the family under this false illusion as if we know what was the cause for the deceased and now what to look for the living. That is very misguided, and we need to break this reflex that I and others are observing when we're doing the molecular autopsy, when the conventional autopsy is negative. We have the maybe test result that we have to be calibrated to know what a VUS really means. Is it possible deleterious? Possible, possibly not. It's a variant of uncertain significance which may stay ambiguous as a VUS, or we may be able to promote it just like that, even though a company had to call it a VUS. Now, the official designation is a ACMG class 3 variant, as if that helps very much. But I want us to recognize these variants as belonging to a place in genetic purgatory. And this place is a real place, and it's scary the mistakes that we're making. Some variants deserve to be stuck in there indefinitely. Some VUSs deserve to get out of purgatory in a split second if we were actually interpreting the genetic test result rather than reading it. And so in the last 10 minutes before our conversation, I want to illustrate just how bad we're doing so that we can really focus on the right way of doing the postmortem investigation of the deceased and of the living. Example one, I'm going to give you two examples. In fair and balanced disclosure, one is going to be evaluated by a he cardiologist, then the other one by a she cardiologist. So we're both making terrible mistakes when it comes to this evaluation. In this case, he cardiologist is evaluating the living sister after the younger sister dies suddenly and unexpectedly, and the autopsy is negative. No DNA-friendly tissue available, or so he cardiologist said. And then he does an evaluation. This is another topic, isn't it? What should be the evaluation of the first-degree relatives when somebody dies suddenly? That is a mess. And now there is an APHRS-led guideline effort where we across the globe are going to be putting together guidelines for what should that evaluation look like in the living and in the dead. So we don't have the issue in like we see in North America, where the living evaluation ranges from condolences only, why are you here, to us ordering every cardiac test imaginable and then doing it every year, because after all, the phenotype can be evolving. But in this case, she gets evaluated, and after that evaluation, the cardiologist has found it and concludes that the incomplete right bundle branch block means something. That's the only finding. Proceeds with genetic testing of the living as a surrogate for genetic testing in the dead. Not good, dangerous. And then finds this, the X that marks the spot, he thinks, in the SCN5A encoded sodium channel. That's what it is, a missense variant from leucine to proline. And then concludes that I know why your sister died, because I have found type 1 Brugada syndrome, for which I won't let happen to you what happened to your sister, protected with an ICD. Closure, clarity, what to do for the rest of the family, genetically testing, negative son, that's good. 3-for-1 special, positive, 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 for which that family then got a 3-for-1 prophylactic ICD. This is when I now meet the family. And I say, oh no. Don't they realize that what the genetic test company called it a VUS, needed to keep it there as a VUS and not overreact to it or prematurely inflate its pathogenicity. Because even in this case, had that variant, yes, it's where LQT3 variants reside. Yes, it's where Brugada variants reside. But yes, it's where a lot of background noise resides. 1 in 50 of us white individuals has a really rare thing in the sodium channel, 1 in 50. And so in this case, this should have been stuck in purgatory. We had the owner of this variant given a classic clinical finding of Brugada syndrome. It still would have been a VUS with mathematically less than a 10% probability of pathogenicity. But it's found, it's acted upon, we do more. Does the sodium channel care whether leucine's there or proline's there? It doesn't, it's wild type. We do more. Remember the one who actually has a phenotype called I am suddenly dead? Well, here is her autopsy material. Harder to do a comprehensive molecular autopsy, but we can certainly get enough DNA to ask the question, does the phenotype positive person called I am dead own exhibit A, the sodium channel variant? Answer, no, she does not. So this is what can happen when you prematurely act on a variant that should not be acted on, when it should have been kept in genetic purgatory, or as my dear friend Peter Schwartz said, to keep the imagery intact, saying Ackerman, that's not a case of purgatory, that's one hell of a situation. Well, let's do the right way and the wrong way, or the wrong way and the right way, where wrong way is now from she cardiologists, so we stay fair and balanced. I love this example because I had a chance to do this with my oldest son, Jager. So here is the family tree, tragedy, 13 years old, suddenly dead. She cardiologist is told by the medical examiner that that's the heart weight, that's what the wall thickness was, and that's what he observed, mild fiber disarray, but concluded that this was inconclusive. So the cardiologist is acting on this family as if we have autopsy inconclusive, negative sudden death, for which she chooses to do an evaluation of the living, which we should. But the evaluation goes south. Here the evaluation begins, and can you see the living's ECG? I don't know if you can see that very well. Let me blow it up. Well, I can make it as big as you want. In Spanish, it's called la normal. But somewhere in the assessment, the decision was made to assess the living with panel-specific testing for long QT syndrome. But in this case, cardiologist was really glad she did that because she nailed it. Because the genetic test company came back saying what the living son has is a pathogenic LQT1 causative mutation. And here's where I want to emphasize an important point. Genetic test interpretation is not literacy, meaning reading the report. Ultimately, we must do to the genetic test report what we do when we stare at an ECG. We decide whether we agree with the ECG interpretation, and we override it if we don't. Here it was taken hook, line, and sinker as the answer was found. Closure, clarity, LQT1 causative, maternally inherited, cascade testing of a lot of the family for which variant positive all over the place. Not only owning the variant, but I hate to tell you, soon to own an implantable defibrillator in a lot of them. Until the pause button eventually was hit, and now we do the evaluation and say, I don't even see long QT syndrome, period, in the living, let alone LQT1. Let's go back to the one who has the phenotype. I am dead. Blood spot card was available. Good. Cascade testing, bad. Negative for exhibit A. Well, not the cause for the sudden death victim, but maybe we've stumbled into maternally inherited LQT1 anyway. No, we haven't. Clinical testing of the living, nobody shows LQT1. Heterologous expression of that variant, the potassium channel doesn't care whether valine's there or isoleucine's there. So let's rewind the clock. Let's rewind the clock and do what we now would view as the newest way to do the whole exome molecular autopsy, which I think the best way is to do it as an upfront genomic triangulation where we compare the genetic code of the deceased with the living parents, because that can quickly help us take what are stuck variants, and if we prove de novo variant, the potential to upgrade that will be much, much better. In fact, we won't have the situation, which is one of my pet peeves with the genetic test companies, and maybe it's yours too, where they tell us VUS found, testing for this VUS not recommended in the family members. I don't like that at all, because it is the testing of that VUS that potentially can give us additional information to demote it or promote it. If I test that VUS and I find out that it's de novo, we are inching much, much closer to a likely pathogenic designation. If we show that it's inherited and everybody who inherited it is completely normal, then that works for it being a VUS tilted towards likely benign. So if you do a upfront whole exome in the trio, we immediately know heritability and de novo status, which in this case, what's the cause? Boom. He didn't die from LQT1. He didn't even have a KCNQ1 variant. What he died from was a sporadic desmonopathy. That's really interesting, isn't it? Because you remember what the medical examiner had observed? 17 millimeter wall thickness, fiber disarray, a perfect concordant fit for cause and manner of death. The wrong way, the right way. The wrong way is scary, and I like this because Wall Street Journal showed how scary it can be by publishing it on Halloween. So with 15 minutes for our conversation, let me leave you with 4 overarching take-home points, and then we'll engage in some questions. First, overall, after the first birthday, before the 35th birthday, 25% of autopsy negative sudden unexplained death is channelopathic. 25%. Depending on the setting, we might get higher, but we are never getting above 50%. Infant death, 10%. Bank those numbers and use them as a frame of reference to judge what others are telling. Second, genotype-phenotype correlations still matter after death. They matter a lot. Autopsy negative sudden unexplained death is not that informative. If it were, the yield would be much higher. So we need to resist the default conclusion of autopsy negative sudden death equals long QT syndrome or CPVT. It doesn't. It doesn't most of the time. So the search needs to continue for what is causing the sudden death of these young people when the autopsy is negative by gross, by microscope, and the molecular autopsy is negative, which is true the majority of the time. And the test is best, in fact, when the autopsy is positive and tells you and I that he died from HCM, from ARVC, and so forth. Third, even though we're making progress, don't tell the medical examiner community that we are. Let's keep the message being that formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissue is the enemy of the molecular autopsy. Get the standard operating procedure in your community to be blood spot cards, blood in EDTA, frozen tissue. And last, X does not always mark the spot. Colossal mistakes are being made by the failure to recognize the existence of genetic purgatory. You must believe in it. We must be a wiser interpreter of the molecular autopsy, of genetic testing in general, alive or dead. Because one thing is for sure that's happening out there that I've gone on record as saying, and that's the following. The only thing worse than telling a family, I don't know why your child died, is to tell them, we have found the answer, but we're wrong. And we didn't even realize we're wrong. And we misled them on closure and clarity. Hopefully this webinar is helping you understand the approach the right way of doing a postmortem genetic investigation and the wrong way of handling and reacting to a molecular autopsy finding. And so I'd love to engage your questions and comments now. I do want to thank those entities that have partnered with us in the Windland Smith Rice Sudden Death Genomics Laboratory at Mayo Clinic. Again, I want to thank Invitae for their partnership with the SADS Foundation. Get to know us at the SADS Foundation, www.stopsads.org. And if you have found the SADS Foundation helpful to your patients alive and if tragically deceased, feel free to a philanthropic way by donating online in the top right corner. I give this also in memory and honor of Wendy, who I never had the privilege of being her physician while alive, where the molecular autopsy ultimately revealed cause and manner of death of LQT2. Should have been caught when alive. And also, if your genetic IQ is not where you want it to be, and you are trying to become at least genetically more savvy, or a genetic cardiologist, or a genetic counselor with greater awareness of genetic heart diseases, I'd love to have you join us in 4 months for our 4th CME course on genetic heart disease. A great place. I've never been there, but I'm told it's great, and would love to have you join us. So that brings us to the end of the monologue, and we have 13 minutes for Dr. Callis to lead us in some questions and answers. So thanks so much for joining us today, and I'd love to hear what you are thinking. Thanks a lot. I think Dr. Callis will come online after he unmutes and then let us know what your questions are. And
Muted.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. We're having a little technical difficulty here getting unmuted. Dr. Ackerman, can you try unmuting yourself? Maybe right click on your name. For some reason it is not working on my control panel.
testing
Okay,
one.
terrific. Sorry about that, Dr. Ackerman. I'm not sure what's going on here.
I didn't give a silent screen monologue the whole time, did I?
No, that just happened. All right, so this now marks the beginning of our question and answer session. If anyone has a question for Dr. Ackerman, go ahead and please submit them in the question pane of the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll go ahead and let's get started. We have a question from Jeanette Strasberger. Thanks for doing this webinar. I'm almost afraid to give you this question. I have a family with a previously healthy 2-year-old male child with sudden cardiac death within 24 hours of a flu shot and concurrent fever. The medical autopsy showed a negative clinical autopsy, but was positive for a VUS in the GPD1L gene, a VUS seen with autosomal dominant Brugada. The mother is pregnant at 34 weeks. The current fetus has fetal magnetocardiographic QTUC of 530 milliseconds. The pregnant patient will have an EKG, magnesium, calcium, vitamin D checked, and avoid QT lengthening drugs for the pregnancy, and after delivery, a neonatal EKG 1 week, 3 weeks, question marks. Should maternal genetics be sent?
Oh, that's a great question, Dr. Strasberger. I love it. I'm not surprised with the complexity of it. And I think a couple things for everybody is you know, we do have a suspicious death there. Certainly, febrile trigger and vaccine trigger has been reported in neonatal infantile toddler Brugada syndrome. I would have been more excited about the potential connection had you told me it was an SCN5A variant. The concern with GPD1L, which we and others published as the second or one of the second or third Brugada syndrome susceptibility genes, there's been a bit of cold water thrown on that gene. In fact, Circulation, we published in Circulation last year, led by Dr. Michael Golub, that all 22 other Brugada syndrome susceptibility genes, apart from the sodium channel, have been demoted to genes of uncertain significance. And so now if you're being told that you have a VUS in GPD1L, and that VUS must obviously be not even the original variant that we tried to put the case forward for causality, I would be very hesitant to ascribe pathogenicity to that GPD1L variant. And in addition, we're now having a discordance with the fetus where there might be in utero QT prolongation from the fetal magneto assessment. So I'd be very, very careful. GPD1L variant have never been associated with long QT syndrome, and now GPD1L and Brugada syndrome, that gene's association has been challenged. So I think I would keep it as unexplained sudden death. I would do a full evaluation of the newborn and both living parents to see if either parent shows a discernible test. What you're going to eventually see in the guidelines will likely be that all first-degree relatives of an inadequately explained sudden death should get, at minimum, from my standpoint, this is now me, not the guidelines yet, at minimum, an ECG, Holter, treadmill, if old enough, and an echo. I would probably do the newborn ECG in that infant, although I would not act on it unless it's profoundly abnormal because of the newborn transition. I'd be more interested in what happens to that QTC at the first well-child visit at 10 to 14 days of age. But this, I would be counseling the family that we do not have the death of that toddler explained clinically or genetically at this time, and that at best we have a potential lead in the postmortem genetic test, but I would have that variant parked pretty deeply in purgatory for now.
Thank you, Dr. Ackerman. When there's no postmortem specimen available for genetic analysis, are there any instances where you would genetically test surviving apparently unaffected family members?
Rarely. Great question, but rarely. I think that's a formula for disaster. I would only test the living if in the course of that living first-degree evaluation you saw a phenotype of concern, where had you saw that phenotype in the living in the absence of the sudden death victim, you would have been compelled to consider genetic testing of that living individual. And if the living family members have zero, nothing for a cardiac phenotype, I would be really careful about doing genetic testing of the living as a surrogate for the deceased. Because I think, as you saw in the one example, it's a formula for disaster. And so phenotype the living, yes. Independently genetically test the living relative if he or she shows a concern of a heritable cardiac condition, for sure. But if everything's clean and normal, I would be hesitant to do that. I would instead be really a pit bull investigator to say, is there any remnant tissue? A source of DNA. We actually have even considered exhuming a sudden death victim to get DNA where we've tested the living. Everybody alive is normal. And so then the idea of DNA testing the deceased with the parent sample, thinking that there could be a de novo, would be a better strategy, although pretty dramatic than to just say, let's go ahead and genetically test the living who show zero phenotype. I would discourage that overall.
Great, thanks, Dr. Ackerman. Dr. Jorge McCormick raises an excellent point and question that I'll read to you here. Speaking of medical examiners, one challenge that he faces is upon reading the reports, he rarely finds a description of RV histology to evaluate for ARVC. Thus, a negative autopsy is often a relative statement. So given his experience with medical examiners and given the discrepancy in the frequency of ARVC as a cause of sudden death in Europe versus the USA, should ARVC be added to the short list of RYR2 and LonQ123 postmortem genes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jorge. I think right now nobody's doing a 4-gene molecular autopsy. So when we do a molecular autopsy, all known arrhythmia and channelopathy and cardiomyopathy genes, I think, should be examined with the understanding that anything in a minor gene is almost completely uninterpretable unless you prove de novo status and so forth. But you get then all of the data. And as long as that you're aware of that, I agree with you. I think PKP2 in particular, which we and others have shown that you can have PKP2 mediated sudden death without any overt signs of ARVC. So I would agree with that completely. And I also agree with the point that what a medical examiner calls as negative is in the eye of the beholder. And we have some good eyes out there, and we have some suboptimal eyes out there. So because of that, one of the things that we've taken the initiative to do as of a couple months ago is we have done, through a benefactor gift, we now provide a comprehensive autopsy to the medical examiners throughout North America, where we will have the autopsy heart read, interpreted, evaluated by eye and by microscope by a cardiac pathologist. And we will do the whole exome molecular autopsy with it, so that we'll have concordance between the phenotype as best assessed by the best eyes and the genotype. And I think that's ultimately the way forward. There's just way too much heterogeneity in the quality of the medical examination when it comes to the heart. Medical examination to rule out bad behavior, you know, they are top notch. When nothing seems to be found and we're now in the natural cause territory, there is tremendous heterogeneity throughout North America, and I actually suspect throughout the world, in the quality of the cardiac autopsy.
Terrific. Thank you. Laura Crandall would like to share a tip for the audience that people should not take at face value what specimens the medical examiner has in house, and to check for blood that's been sent out for toxicology, and check with the toxicology lab whether they have any excess, as well as newborn cards and possibly cord blood as well. You know, we know how challenging it can be to get viable specimens for postmortem testing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Laura. Don't take the nothing available at face value. I think that is the detective work that the physicians and medical examiners and the families needs to engage in, because we just did one last week where the family was under the impression nothing available, and looking at the medical examiner report, it stated retained tissue, cardiac specimen slides, so for long story short, there was tissue. And so that's a great tip, to not just take nothing there as signed, sealed, and delivered.
Thank you. Dr. Ackerman, are there any guidelines available for medical examiners in the context of genetic testing?
Evolving, and Laura Crandall and I are part of an effort, and Laura, who's joined us, has been a huge influence in trying to get the heterogeneity in the medical examiner community decreased, and to get the standard operating procedures for DNA-friendly tissue, as I just mentioned, and to guide them on doing the molecular autopsy. Difficult in the past when a medical examiner's budget is very limited, price point out of range, but now with the changes happening in the increased accessibility to genetic testing, they are doing it more and more. The problem is that as they're doing it independently of cardiologists, they in part are overreacting to a VUS and acting on it as if it's the real deal instead of being as restrained as I'm arguing that we must be. And so we really need to get the whole team assembled and the whole team on the same page. And I think we're going to see guidance in the forensic world, the medical examiner world, kind of converging with this new guidelines that it will ultimately come out in the cardiac world that will be guiding cardiologists as to what we in the cardiology community expect the minimal evaluation of the deceased and the minimal evaluation of the decedent's first-degree relatives to look like. So I think in 2 years from right now, there will be guidance in place that will really be providing a much clearer roadmap of how the sudden death should be investigated in the deceased and in the decedent's living relatives.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ackerman, I see that we're at the end of our hour and our time together today, and I'd like to thank the audience here for all their participation, and thank you for sharing your insights with us.
It's a pleasure, and I'm happy to stay on if you've received more questions for a few minutes. If it's time to go, for those of you who took the time, thanks a lot for joining us. I hope you found value out of this, and I consider it a privilege to partner with you in the patients and the families and the decedents that we may be tragically encountering as well. But I'm here at your discretion before the official goodbye, Tom.
Well, wonderful. Well, with that in mind, let's run through some of the remaining questions here that we weren't able to get to within the hour.
Let's do it.
Winners Hardy asked, when you only have formalin-fixed tissue for genetic testing, what is the best SOP for DNA extraction? Can you recommend an article or reference?
Yes. So there's a paper that was recently published by our research team with Joe Malashewski that showed our success in getting decent quality DNA from samples up to 10 plus years old out of formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissue. And that does an approach. But I think also many of the genetic test companies are now accepting that source of sample for, so you would have to check with the company like Invitae, who's sponsoring this, to see if they have incorporated that in their success at DNA extraction as an acceptable material. Some companies, the answer is currently yes, some the answer is no, and this is why I don't want the medical examiners to get too comfortable with that as the tissue source to where they don't even bother trying to do tissue that is certainly more DNA friendly. But that would probably be the best scientific publication. And then it's just inquiring with the genetic test company to see if they are currently accepting that source of tissue for DNA.
Great. Laura Crandall would like to let the audience know that hopefully the name and AAP guidelines will hopefully be published this summer.
Fantastic.
And Elizabeth Bundock asks, because prices have come down so far, some medical examiners are beginning to do and to pay for genetic testing for SUDS cases. For autopsy negative cases, is this worth doing if the medical examiner is not going to pay for trio testing? So I think what Elizabeth is meaning in the first part of her question is that the pricing has really come down for panel testing. I don't think that's really the case for trios yet.
Right. It is worth doing as long as we have the calibration of the likelihood of it being positive. And in that case, as long as I would then disregard the company's suggestion of this VUS is not eligible for family testing, because that's exactly what I would do if a variant of uncertain significance was found in one of the major genes. Because if you were to be able to go on and show that that VUS in a major disease gene, RYR2, LQT1, so forth, so on, PKP2, was not present in mom or dad, and mom and dad is mom and dad, then that variant gets moved out of purgatory, really close, if not completely out of it, to likely pathogenic. So I think you would have to say, I know it's saying don't test the VUS, but I would test the VUS in that situation. So yes, I would do it if they would only pay, or the price point is only for the decedent, and then cascade testing of the relatives, but with those cautions in place.
Great, thank you. The following question came from Catherine Anderson. This one came, just for context, it came in about the first 15-20 minutes of your presentation. So you may have addressed some of this later on. But why is a VUS from an autopsy positive sample more convincingly pathogenic than a VUS from a phenotype positive living individual? She would hesitate to test family members for the VUS that is otherwise not understood or predicted benign, since the negative result may be falsely reassuring.
Yes, so I think a VUS in an autopsy positive decedent, say hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, has an incredibly higher pretest probability of not being a VUS but being likely pathogenic compared to a VUS in a minor gene in somebody who's autopsy negative. Both get called a VUS, and to the ordering physician, they don't realize that under the rubric of a VUS, there's a tremendous range. And so some are ever so close to getting out, likely pathogenic. Some are getting close to being demoted deep into Dante's Inferno, likely benign. So a VUS is not a VUS is not a VUS. But when the autopsy is positive for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that VUS in a major gene, myosin heavy chain, MYH7, is so close to being out of purgatory and likely pathogenic. Whereas if I'm a VUS in the sodium channel in somebody where the autopsy is negative, and I don't even have clinical data to even make a suspicion that they look like LQT3 or Brugada 1, no comparison of those two VUSs in terms of their pretest likelihood of being likely pathogenic and actionable, or still stuck and stay stuck.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ackerman. I'm happy to report that you've actually cleared the list of questions that have come in.
Oh, great. Those were great questions for those who are still with us. And I'm again, if this brings us to the end, all the best. And I would, if you've enjoyed this, give the feedback, and I would love to rejoin you for webinar number 4. There's one coming up, and maybe Tom can give you a heads up of the date for the second webinar with SADS Foundation and Invitae support, which is going to be delivered by the vice president of our foundation, the SADS Foundation, Dr. Susan Etheridge, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine, and our vice president for the SADS Foundation. So I do hope you can rejoin us for that webinar, which will deal with living people called athletes who have inherited heart conditions, and what is the current state of continuing to play, returning to play, or maybe not playing if you have a genetic heart disease.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ackerman. Dr. Etheridge's webinar is coming up in 2 weeks, and anyone who joined us today will be getting an email with a registration link.
Great. So if you like this, feel free to give feedback to Tom Callis at Invitae. Feel free to put out a tweet. I'm new to Twitter. as of 2 months ago with the Twitter handle MJ Ackerman, MD, Ph.D. And so would love to hear from you either publicly or feel free to email me anytime. I'm delighted to partner with each and every one of you. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. And thanks SADS Foundation and Invitae for making this webinar happen. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good evening.